Well, good evening. Welcome to all of you who have joined us so far. My name is Frank Bowles. I'm the director of the Clarke Historical Library, and thank you for joining us for another of our Thursday night presentations in our online speaker series for the spring 2021 semester. This is a presentation we're particularly fond of because, as some of you know, the Clarke Historical Library is the home of the Aladdin Homes papers. Those papers came to us in the early 1990s and were processed with a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I think I'm still morally obliged to say that because it's in the legal requirements of the grant. With that by way of introduction, let me simply turn the screen over to Andrew and Wendy Mutch. They are both librarians by profession in southeastern Michigan, but their avocation is hunting down old Aladdin houses. So with that very brief and simple introduction, Andrew and Wendy, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Frank, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us this evening as we take a little exploration on the topic of Aladdin homes of southeastern Michigan. I'm Andrew Mutch, and this is my wife,
Wendy.
And just by way of location, we're coming to you live from Novi, Michigan. We're inside our 1926 Sears Hamilton. We don't own an Aladdin house, but we do own a kit house, a Sears catalog house from Sears Roebuck. But we love kit houses, and we love to talk about the topic. So we hope by the end of tonight's presentation, you'll have learned a little bit more about the Aladdin Home Company as well as kit houses in general. So let's go ahead and get started. So tonight's presentation, just a quick outline of what we're going to cover. We're going to start out first with hopefully brief history of Aladdin homes. Aladdin was a going concern for a number of decades, so we're going to cover a lot of territory there. Next, we're going to walk you through the process of buying and building your own Aladdin kit house. And then we'll talk about what processes we go through to discover Aladdin homes, some of which are over 100 years old. And then finally, we'll finish with a photo tour of Aladdin houses that we have discovered here in southeastern Michigan. So the history of Aladdin homes started with a boat. Back in the early 1900s in Bay City, Michigan, there were several companies that were in the business of manufacturing what were called at that time knockdown boats. And the idea of a knockdown boat was that a company would manufacture the frame of a boat and in a factory, cut all the pieces to size that were necessary to construct that boat, and then knock that frame of that boat down, package up all those pieces, and then ship them off to a customer somewhere across the United States, typically by railroad car. And then that customer, with a set of instructions and all that material, would reassemble those that knockdown boat into a boat, and then take it out on the water. And they would quickly discover whether they had properly followed the instructions or not. And in fact, there was so much demand for this idea of buying and building your own boat that there were multiple companies in Bay City, Michigan, building and selling these knockdown boats. Well, an enterprising young man by the name of William Sovereign was observing this. He actually worked for one of the knockdown boat companies. He was a lawyer by trade, but at that time was doing some other work. And it occurred to William Sovereign that if people were willing to buy and build a boat simply from the parts and a set of instructions, what about a house? The thinking that William came up to it was that boats, you had a limited market. You know, they could only be sold where people live by the water, coastal areas, but a house could be sold to anybody, anywhere. And so William approached his brother Otto with his idea, and Otto was pretty skeptical of the whole thing. Otto was by trade a journalist in sales, on the sales side of the newspaper operation, and he wasn't so sure about this, primarily because neither of them had any knowledge or experience with the process of building a house. Their parents had owned a lumber mill, so they did have some familiarity with that part of the operation. But this was new territory for them. And so Otto proposed to his brother William. He said, well, if you can figure out the logistics of this, how to actually put together a house and sell it as a kit, I'll figure out how to market it to the masses. And so William got down to work and started drafting his initial plans for a basic, really it was like a cottage and boathouse. And the two brothers together formed the North American Construction Company. William as president, Otto as secretary, treasurer, and general manager. There were very few other employees. I believe they asked their mother to help them out handling correspondence. Incorporated in Bay City, Michigan. And Otto, being the marketing man that he was, realized that North American Construction Company is a whole long name that would be difficult to remember. And so he came up with the idea of selling these new kit houses under the name Aladdin, named after the genie of literature who was able to build a castle in a day. And so the idea was that you would be able to build a house in a day, or pretty close to it. And so under the Aladdin name, the brothers put out some advertising. And Otto realized the market for these basic build-it-yourself houses wasn't in publications like those for contractors or people involved in industrial operations. It was your average average worker who, looking to save a few dollars, was willing to put the time and hard work into building their own home. And so they put some ads in some of the popular publications of the days, like Saturday Evening Post and Collier's, advertising their basic cottages and homes that could be assembled by yourself, at a relatively relatively cheap cost. And very soon after they started advertising, orders started coming in for their houses. In fact, it was a bit of a challenge because it was really the two brothers working together at their mother's kitchen table. And so they quickly had to ramp up operations and find people in companies in Bay City who could meet the demand for these orders. And so that was in 1906 is when they first started selling their cottages and homes. And within a very short time, they had a full-scale operation going in Bay City. So they were selling cottages and homes and garages to customers across the United States. And Bay City really was a logical place for this to happen because Bay City had quite a few advantages going for it. First off, it was well situated with water access to the Great Lakes for raw materials, as well as multiple rail lines that they had access to be able to ship houses across the United States. And then Bay City had a long history of industrial operations related to timber from the late 1800s, when much of the northern part of the lower peninsula of Michigan was logged off, and much of that timber made its way to Bay City. And so there was a lot of knowledge and background, as well as the machinery necessary to manufacture everything necessary to build a house. So because they just kind of started out on a shoestring operation, the Sovereign brothers had to contract with a local mill, Lewis Manufacturing, to cut the lumber for their houses. And as new orders came in, they would send those over to Lewis, and Lewis would fulfill those. Well, the demand for Aladdin homes got to be picked up to such a degree that Lewis came to the Sovereign brothers and said, look, we need to expand our operations, but in order for us to do that, we're going to have a bigger piece of the pie. We like to share more of the profits that you're taking from this, this venture. Well, the Sovereign brothers weren't really interested in sharing the profits with anybody. And this being Bay City, the Lewis Manufacturing wasn't the only lumber mill in town. And so the Sovereign brothers took their business down the street to International Mill and Timber. And Lewis Manufacturing said, well, fine, but guess what? We've learned quite a bit about the whole process of how you manufacture kit houses. And so Lewis started putting out their own line of kit houses under the name Lewis Homes. And so now from Bay City, you had two companies competing in the kit house business. Fast forward a couple years, and demand for Aladdin homes continued to increase significantly. And International Mill and Timber went to the Sovereign brothers and said, well, look, we need to expand our facilities. You guys, we're just going gangbusters, but we need to get a bigger piece of the pie here. And this being Bay City, there was yet another mill that the Sovereign brothers were able to work with. In fact, they purchased outright, I think finally realizing that they couldn't be at the whim of these other companies. And so International Mill and Timber started putting out homes themselves under the name Sterling Homes. And so by the let's say 15, 16, Bay City, Michigan was home to three of the biggest kit house companies in the country, sending out thousands of homes across the country to customers in every part of the United States. Well, not only were things going great in Bay City, but there was really a demand for this whole idea of buying and building your own home. And when somebody's making money at it, you're always going to get competition. And it soon caught the eye of the folks in Chicago at Sears Roebuck, which was one of the biggest mail order companies in the country. And Sears Roebuck in 1908, so just 2 years after Aladdin got started their own line of mail order homes, this being the first catalog. Their book, they called them Modern Homes, and competing directly with Aladdin. Sears' biggest competitor in the mail order business was Montgomery Ward, and they followed suit and selling homes. They adapted a little bit down the line the Wardway home name. And another big competitor was based in Davenport, Iowa, the Gordon Van Tyne Company. In fact, Gordon Van Tyne supplied houses not only through their own Gordon Van Tyne line, but also to Montgomery Ward. So it's interesting to see how all those companies interacted. And so as we're approaching 1918, 1919, these six companies are all competing with each other for the business of kit house, mail order houses to customers across the United States. And it was quite a successful business for everybody involved. So in the early years, this is one of the earliest houses that Aladdin sold. And they actually referred to it, thinking back to the knockdown boats, they called it a knockdown dwelling house, which they, I think, quickly realized was a bad marketing term to use because it gave the impression that, a good wind would come up and put this house on its side, which is obviously not what they wanted. And for years thereafter, not only did knockdown never appear again in the catalog, but Aladdin made a point, as did the other kit house manufacturers, that these houses were permanent houses. These were not something you would put up in a day and then knock down the next and move to another location. These were intended to be permanent houses. And from these very modest early houses, by the time we get, this is from the 1918 catalog, here is the villa, which Aladdin liked to refer to as a bit of old Italy. But you can see this is a very large, grand two-story house. I think most folks would look at this and be shocked that it's a kit house. But Aladdin offered houses of all sizes and styles. And this was true, of course, of all the kit house manufacturers, everything from something like this. Again, 1918, the Aladdin Marsden, a very attractive bungalow-style house with a lot of arts and crafts details. They even offered some houses that were finished in face brick. This is an example of a house a little bit later. And then the styles and evolved, of course, as taste and changed. And so when we moved into the 30s, this is an example from the 1930s, a little bit more minimalist design, a lot less of the arts and crafts style design that we typically associate with kit houses. But these companies were selling styles that people were interested in, and so they looked to the popular styles of the day and did their best to model them. But Aladdin was not just selling houses. They were also selling a whole lot of other structures. One of the most popular lines for them were cottages. Here is the Ocean Park, which was offered in 5 different floor plans, and depending on the size of the cottage, from $409 to $578. This is in the late 20s. What's interesting to me about this Ocean Park floor plan is if you look at all 5 of these floor plans that are shown here, not one of them has a bathroom. So this was clearly a cottage for rugged living. This is not luxury living accommodations here. We also had garages, and an Aladdin House customer also purchased a garage. Here's the Cadillac, maybe to keep your Ford in. And again, you can see it's offered in different sizes depending on how much space that you needed. If you were a farming family and you had need of a barn, sometimes you just needed the barn, not the house. Aladdin could sell you a barn. In fact, it could sell you a wide range of structures that were suitable for the farm environment. And they even sold some interesting small commercial buildings. Here's an example of a small filling station that somebody might have built in the late teens or early 20s as the cars really took off in popularity. And they sold a number of these kinds as well. And we know that they sold these because we've seen these in the sales records for Aladdin. They had customers for these. And a big part of Aladdin's sales, especially during the 19s, so 1915 through say 1925, were to industrial concerns. So this might have been a coal mine, or a sugar beet factory, or a textile mill. There was a big problem with providing affordable housing during this time period because there was a huge amount of population growth happening. Oftentimes these factories were located in locations that didn't have a lot of available housing. And so Aladdin, as you can see from this catalog cover, actually targeted those companies because they were looking to purchase and build quickly housing for their workers. Probably the most interesting example of this isn't located in the United States. It's actually located in Birmingham, England. It's a place called Austin Village that was constructed during the First World War for the Austin Motor Company, obviously the name. And they had a large factory there, and obviously England was well into the war for a number of years before the United States entered it, and they needed a place for their workers to live. And so they reached out to the Aladdin Company, and Aladdin specially designed 200 homes. They're all the same identical design, but a custom design, and manufactured all the material for that and sent that overseas. Tragically, the first shipment of that actually didn't make it to England. The ships carrying the materials for those homes were sunk by a German U-boat on their way over. And so a second shipment was quickly put together and did safely make it over there. And then you can see how these houses were constructed very quickly. What's interesting is because of local regulations in England, every 25th house had to be a brick structure. And so you can see, if you can see in the image there, those kind of taller two-story structures, those were deliberately built as fire breaks. But it turns out they weren't necessary. The English were really nervous about these homes. They kind of saw them as temporary. But in fact, they're not temporary. In fact, they're still there 100 years later. And this has actually been designated as a nationally significant historic site in England because it's such a unique place. And so the perhaps largest collection of still standing Aladdin homes is in Austin Village in Birmingham, England. Definitely worth checking out if you get yourself over there. And so as we enter the 1920s, it really was the best of times for Aladdin. U.S. home building took off at the end of the Great War, as we referred to World War I. As suburban growth happened, Aladdin was selling thousands of kit homes per year in the 1920s, as were its competitors. They were all doing very well. In 1926 alone, Aladdin sold over 3,500 homes. And Aladdin really ramped up its operations beyond Bay City, spanning the United States and into Canada. The Canadian operations started in 1916. And this map really illustrates that. You can see the headquarters in Bay City, but Aladdin also had mills in Portland, Oregon, and Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and Wilmington, Delaware. And of course, you can see their Canadian operations centered in Toronto, Ontario, and Wilmington, North Carolina. Yes. And this young lady had a very prominent role in one of those mills, and Wendy's going to talk a little bit about her.
So I would like you to meet Miss Elsie Lemke, and she is significant in Aladdin's success, I would say, because in 1912, at age 19, she graduated from business college and was hired as a stenographer at Aladdin for the princely sum of $8 a week. And she learned the business through all the letters that she typed, and she started reading and remembering the contents of those letters. And that's how she learned the business from the ground up, from all aspects. And her superiors noticed that she knew things and was willing to share her knowledge. And she rose through the business and became the private secretary of the president. And he also noticed her performance, gave her her own private office. And 10 years later, she was indeed promoted to be general manager of that Wilmington plant. And I find it interesting that the Free Press at age 29 is still referring to her as a girl. Yes. Okay. But she's directing this $1 million housing company. And she had some things to say, as you can imagine. And here's a quote from her. She says, "It doesn't seem unusual to me that a woman should be engaged in this work. If men did the housework, it is probable that many of them would understand interior designing better than they do." So she had an attitude. And then there was another article that they were praising her for her quick success and everything. But at the end of their article, they stated, "Here are some other interesting things about Miss Lemke. In the first place, she is pretty. She likes beautiful clothes and she wears them. She is proficient in all the newest dance steps, and she finds time to have a host of both men and women friends, regardless of her rapid climb to success." So even though she was successful in business, they still wanted to point out that she was feminine.
And in one of the articles, it did note that that Wilmington, North Carolina mill that she operated, that she was the manager of, she oversaw 400 men, and that she was
paid as much as the men in similar positions. So that was quite something for the time.
Yes, very
compensated for her skills.
Very interesting aspect of the Aladdin operation at that time. And then this happened. The stock market crash of October 1929, Black Thursday, which really, for many people, signaled the beginning of the Great Depression that obviously had a huge impact on the United States and the world economy. And as you can imagine, the kit house industry as well. Aladdin actually started seeing its sales fall off even before Black Thursday. In comparison, some of the other kit house companies like Sears and Montgomery Ward really didn't start feeling the impact of the Great Depression until the 1930s. And I think the reason for that was that those companies did offer financing to people purchasing their homes. Aladdin did not. Aladdin was always you had to pay cash for their homes before you could receive the materials for it. Whereas these other companies like Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward did offer mortgages to people. And I think because Aladdin's customers were a little bit more sensitive to that, to the economy, because they were paying that all out of pocket, I think that really kind of was like a bellwether that things were starting to go south, even though that was not immediately obvious. And at the depths of the Great Depression, the home sales just completely collapsed in the United States. These companies were selling, where they had been selling thousands of homes a year, we're lucky if they were selling a couple hundred a year. All those mortgages that Sears offered, many of their customers defaulted on them, and Sears ended up writing off $11 million in mortgages in 1933 dollars. 1934, I think, actually is when they wrote those off. So a massive amount of loss for them. And Montgomery Ward saw the writing on the wall and just completely bailed out of the business in after 1931. As we got to the end of the 1930s, the economy slowly recovered and the sales for Aladdin picked up. But as they did, suddenly, we were running into restrictions related to the onset of World War II. And in fact, to the point that it was almost impossible to build residential housing. So Aladdin shifted their production to military housing. And as this article from Aladdin highlights, they had a history of this dating back to the First World War. And so during World War II, they spent most of their efforts providing barracks and similar structures for the military. After the war ended, they transitioned back to selling residential homes because we had another wave of suburban residential growth happening across the United States as all the sailors and soldiers returned home and started looking for new houses and places for their families to live. But there were new options now for people looking for a house. In fact, this was very popular. Places like Levittown, Pennsylvania, where construction was done on an assembly line scale and methods, and literally almost building a house a day at some point in some of these developments. And so where kit houses had always had an advantage in terms of being able to reduce a lot of the costs related to the labor and assembly of houses, when you're competing against people building at this kind of scale, suddenly you lose that advantage. That having been said, Aladdin and its competitors in Bay City continued to provide and sell houses, and actually those styles changed. Here we see a very typical suburban ranch style house with the perfect green lawn and the homeowner out front probably watering that thing every day. And so they did evolve to meet changing tastes and preferences. And while they did see their sales rebound after World War II, it was never at the levels that we saw during the 1920s. And as we move through the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s, demand for kit houses continued to decline. They just didn't have the cost advantage, and people just didn't have the time and skills necessary to do it yourself as these houses became more and more complex. What really the economic conditions in the 1970s really took down all three of the Bay City kit home companies, which were still in operation. Aladdin, being a family-owned business, still being in the Sovereign family, was the last man standing when it sold its final home in 1981. So having covered the history of the Aladdin Company, next we want to talk a little bit about the process of buying and building your kit house. And I'm going to preface this by saying one of the challenges of covering a company like Aladdin is that they were around for 75 years. And while some things kind of were consistent over those years, things did change over the years as well. So we're going to generalize a little bit here as we talk about buying and building your kit house. But as a general rule, most of what we talk about applied to most of the houses sold during most of the years that they were in business. Okay, with that big caveat, let's move on.
So who would be crazy enough to buy a house from a catalog, you might ask? We have to put ourselves back in time. Some of you might be old enough to remember when the Sears catalog was in your home. But Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs were in pretty much everybody's home. They were very familiar with them, and everyone knew the quality of the products. The customer satisfaction was very important. They were ensured of the quality, or you could return it. So it's not so crazy, I guess. And it was a good source for things that you couldn't buy locally. So, and you could, I would say it was the Amazon of their day. So it is not crazy. We do it all the time. We order things sight unseen and hope they are what we want when they arrive. So that was what I would say. And you would save on material as a benefit. They said they brought the material straight from the forest to the home for you. They cut out the middleman, so you did not have to pay the local lumber yard their cut of the product. And also, they did the precise machine cuts at the factory. So you were not measuring twice and cutting once at home. And they were able to get 20 feet of lumber from a 16-foot board. Now, it is not magic. As you can see, it is mathematical by the cuts. They did that for you. And here it saves on labor. Again, you are not doing the cutting yourself. They said carpenter work for a house could average $300 to $1,200. So you're paying yourself by doing the effort yourself. And here's an example from Sears of a real world experiment they did. They built the exact same house, one the traditional way, the other the ready cut way. So you can see they saved many, many hours of labor. And you might notice the work site. The one that's the traditional on the right is very messy. There's a lot of scrap lumber lying around, and apparently someone didn't know how to do their figuring very well. And you also save on architect fees. I don't know how many of you have hired an architect. They are not cheap. But here Aladdin has a famous board of 7 very expensive men to work for you and make the plans for you. They are master designers, builders, manufacturers, and they would figure everything out for you so you didn't have to do it on your end. And as a side note, Sears had a similar board, but they had a woman advisor on theirs. So there was a lot of competition for your kit house dollars, and Aladdin, you can imagine, wanted marketing as much as Sears and Montgomery Ward were. Aladdin was sort of the odd man out because he was not so well known. They would pay you $1 for every knot you found. They were so certain that they were giving you the highest quality of materials that you would not find those knots. And they would also offer to pay $1 for every person you let tour your kit home, and if they would think about buying one themselves. So from the front door, they maybe would install this little knocker. I have one that I bought on eBay, and he's very cute. He is the Aladdin genie, and when you raise his arms, it says Aladdin Homes. So right from the guests from the front door would realize what kind of a home they're entering. And then the doorknobs had the Aladdin logo on them too. So as you tour the house, you'd be able to be reminded of that. So I do have a little Aladdin catalog here. And so Montgomery Ward and Sears has a little bit fatter and bigger catalogs. The Aladdin one is tiny and it is special. It is a leatherette binding. It has room on the front for a gold writing of the homeowner's name. And they are also full color, and some of them have double page spreads. They're quite lovely.
So next we're going to walk through the process of ordering your Aladdin kit house. And the first step is to request one of those catalogs. And Aladdin, generally speaking, didn't have the advantage that a Montgomery Ward or a Sears Roebuck had, because those catalogs were in every house. So they had to really reach out through different sources. So a lot of times Aladdin was advertising in newspapers across the country. In addition to the magazine advertisements we saw earlier, they did those as well. Here, example of Aladdin Ready Cut Homes, an ad. This was actually a full page ad. I gave you a part of that. Here's another example of an Aladdin ad. This was in one of the Detroit Free Press. You can see this ad, it actually mentions the Detroit office. That was very unusual. Generally, Aladdin did not have offices and salespeople around the country. In fact, they made a point in their advertising to say that
our catalog is our only salesman.
Right. that any question you might have should be answered through the catalog. But because there was such a volume of sales in the Detroit area, apparently, they decided to open an office to meet that demand. Once you received your Aladdin catalog, you would review the range of models and prices. And as we've touched on, a wide range of models coming at many different price points. And so there really was something for everybody in those catalogs. And once you decided on what you wanted to order, you would complete this one-page order sheet, which is pretty amazing. Some of the information that was important on the sheet was where the railroad depot location where your house would be shipped if they had a freight agent there. Aladdin required you to put money down to place your order, so you had to know how much that was. And then important details like what color paint did you want the house painted, because they gave you a number of different options on colors, and you could choose all the way down to the color of the paint of your house. And we'll see that actually in a little bit. So inside the catalog, every house had a page that would show a nice little illustration of the outside of the house, giving you an idea of what it looked like when it was constructed. Many of the houses had these really cool 3D view that helped give you a sense of how all the rooms laid out and flowed and were interconnected, and how you might use those spaces. They also included floor plans showing you the size of the rooms. So you can see, for instance, bedrooms in the house, 10 by 12, or in 10 by 13. So these aren't very large rooms. In the case of the Aladdin Pomona, which was a popular bungalow style house, it actually came in 2 different floor plans. You can see one floor plan was designed to be able to utilize the second floor. And then you can see that in the middle of the second story layout. Or there was just a single story floor plan if you didn't have use or plan to use the attic space. Aladdin also provided some interior views to kind of give you a sense of what a finished Aladdin house would look like inside. These were generalized. These weren't necessarily specific to a particular model, but you can see the 1920s version of an Aladdin interior and the design of that versus the 1940s, 1950s version. So a question we often get about kit houses are, how much do these houses cost? Because you look through these old catalogs and you might see a model like this, the Columbia, which lists for $487. I'm like, wow, I mean, that's nothing. So this is 1928 prices. $487 would buy you the Columbia. Came in several different floor plans. Does include a bathroom, so don't worry about that. All the way up to the Capitol, $1,695. This is a large 2-story Dutch colonial design house. This was the most expensive one in 1928. Just to give you a sense of the size of these 2 houses, the Columbia was less than 500 square feet in size. The Capitol, the big Dutch colonial one, was almost 1,900 square feet in size. And so quite a range there. So what was the cost of these houses to build them? Well, the list price got you kind of the basic house, but there were other costs that you had to pay to build your house that weren't reflected in that price. For instance, you were responsible, obviously you had to have a piece of property to build on, so if you didn't have a lot or property, you had to purchase that. The basement foundation was on you, so that was something that you had to pay for. There's costs associated with that. Extras, which we'll cover in a minute. And then if you needed assistance building some or all of the house or elements of the house, you would obviously have to pay folks to do that. So once you factor all that in, typically 2 to 3 times that price. So the Columbia might have cost you less than $500 to purchase it from Aladdin, but it would cost you $1,500 at the end of the day, $1,000 to $1,500. Likewise, the Capitol, would have cost you maybe $4,000 to $6,000 to finish that completely. And here are some of the extras. You can see these were things that were not included in the base price of the house. So if you had need for these, and I think most people wanted electrical fixtures and bathroom fixtures and a furnace, you needed to purchase those as well. What's interesting is we've done quite a few presentations on Sears houses, and Sears did the same thing. They sold folks these extras as well. One of the things I noticed going through the sales records for Aladdin houses is very few of their customers purchased these extras through Aladdin. So even though Aladdin offered all of these things and that you could have bought them with the house, it appears most of their customers forgo doing that through Aladdin and purchase those through some other source. And again, I think this gets back to the type of customer that was buying Aladdin house. They were very dollar conscious and very frugal, and so they probably could get these at a cheaper price, or maybe didn't want to spend that money at that time, that they wanted to get closer to the house being finished before they went and spent the dollars necessary to purchase some of these things. And so where Sears customers we often would see would include these extras in the cost of their house because they were typically financing that with a mortgage. And so they wanted to get all those costs in together. Aladdin customers typically did not do that, which is an interesting distinction once I realized what was going on there. So these are the things that were included in your with your order from Aladdin that were included as part of that base price: all the framing, lumber, and siding for the house, all the roofing materials. Now, we did discover, going through sales records and reading the catalogs, that gutters were not included, which is different from Sears. Sears always included gutters. And so if you wanted gutters on your house, if the design of your house required them, that was an extra cost for you. All the flooring throughout the house. Aladdin was like the other kit house companies in that you could choose the quality of flooring that you wanted. And so some people, pine flooring was kind of the base level, and some people were fine with pine. A lot of people upgraded to oak. And typically in a house of that era, you'd see, if you made that choice, you'd see oak flooring in the public areas of the house, and then lower quality flooring, maple or pine, in the areas of the house where typically guests didn't go. So bedrooms, maybe the kitchen or bathroom. They also included millwork, so all that trim that you will see in houses from that era, the doors and the window, including the hardware, as Wendy showed an example, some of the decorative hardware that Aladdin offered. Walls, interior walls were either finished with plaster, so they would provide lath for that, or Aladdin also sold a precursor to drywall that they called Aladdin plasterboard. It was essentially, it looked like drywall, but it was made out of plaster. Nails, and they shipped them by the keg because you had a lot of nailing to do. And as I mentioned, you had a choice of the colors of interior and exterior paints, as well as finishes that for your wood trim and wood doors and everything, wood floors, everything wood in the house. Aladdin also offered some really nice built-in cabinetry and other extras that some homeowners, quite a few homeowners actually purchased at least some of the extra built-ins for their homes, and you can see some of those on the right. Things that were not included in your order were plaster, bricks, and foundation blocks. Those were too expensive to ship by rail and could be obtained locally cheaper. So Aladdin, like the other kit house companies, would have you source that locally.
So while you are waiting for your shipment from them, you've got homework. If you wanted a basement or your house required it, you had to dig that and then do the foundation. You could purchase the blocks locally, or you could make them yourself. So here you see the Aladdin concrete block machine. And if you really want to ramp up production, you can invest in the hand and power batch mixer to really get things going. And here you see this example of this worker man doing this very, looks like a fun job, doesn't it? He's looking sort of tired as we move towards the right. And then you get your notice that your shipment has arrived. It's at the rail yard. Get on over there. I hope you have a lot of friends and family because you don't have a semi-truck to move all that material. And the railroad will give you approximately 48 hours to get your stuff out of that boxcar because they've got more things to do with it. And luckily, they packed your car very tidily and with a good process. The things that you're going to need first, they put on first. So as you unload it, the things that you need first are on top of your pile. Yes, next. Oh, here we are at our home site. All of our lumber is so tidy. It's marked. We know exactly what goes where. You can imagine how satisfied these two gentlemen feel with their progress. And then they look at each other and they say, now what? Yes. Well, great. They gave you a manual to figure out what to do with all of that material. The Aladdin Manual is approximately 300 pages. They put all of the buildings together, whether it was a barn or a shed or a house, and then they had specifics for the different kinds of buildings. And they encourage the builder, if it was you or someone you hired, to read all of Part 3 carefully. It will steer the home builder clear of many pitfalls and do away with costly mistakes. Other kit home companies had that same, be careful, read it before you start your work, or you might not get what you want. And there is a short movie by Buster Keaton. It's a silent one, and it's called 1 Week. It features a couple that does not follow the instructions through no fault of their own, and they end up with a house that does not look like what they expect. It's very funny. I highly recommend it. And then now we have this little pictorial story of Andrew. He changed the presentation, so I'm going to let him do this.
Well, I just wanted to show this is a couple examples of the materials that would arrive from Aladdin. Each of the companies had different methods for marking their material, and Aladdin liked to be very clear and spelled out. This, you can see an example, says root sheathing, and then you also received a set of blueprints that showed you exactly where everything went. So all the material was marked to match the blueprints, and in theory you would just follow right along and everything would come right together. Okay, now
Aladdin was so certain that you could do this on your own that they featured this little pamphlet in 1911 of how 3 Chicago school teachers built their own house. So yes, they ordered one and it was shipped to a place near Muskegon, Michigan. And here you see them working, mixing the concrete. Those ladies brought with them just a hammer, a level, paintbrush, and a handbook on mixing cement. And from there, they labored, they followed the instructions. There was no man on site, they were pleased to tell you, and they erected this house. I love how they're wearing their full school getup, it seems. They are not wearing overalls by any means, and no skilled labor on the site. And the pamphlet called it a delightful vacation. I'm not sure if that was true, but they got the job done.
And I'm amused by this last picture, the way the ladder's precariously perched against the side of the house as they're painting, and apparently there's plenty of people who have done the same on their own, I'm sure. And this was it really was a cottage that they built, the style A, 2 rooms. I think whoever drew this, though, had a little bit problem with proportion of scale, because you can see what they built was actually quite a bit taller. And even in the description, it talks about how the interior room is 8 feet 2 inches tall, which that little drawing is much too low for that, but maybe they just need to fit on the page. Okay, next we're going to walk you through the process we go through of discovering Aladdin homes. Excuse me. So if you're really fortunate, you live in a place like Bay City, Michigan, where you can go down just about any street and find Aladdin homes, or just look for landmarks like Sovereign Drive. And if you're really fortunate, you have helpful homeowners who have carved into the concrete sidewalk in front of their house the name of their house, the model, the LaSalle by Aladdin Homes, built in 1920. And there it is. Unfortunately, that's not the case for most of these homes. And many of these homes are now 100 years or older, which means they've changed, and the records related to them, the history related to them has been lost. And so it makes it challenging for us to find them. Well, one of the great things we have is access to the Clarke Historical Library at Central Michigan University. And as Frank touched on earlier, they have this tremendous collection of material related to Aladdin homes. And so we can start with the Aladdin catalogs, because from the catalogs we can see house designs. And as we're driving around a neighborhood with houses from the 20s or the 30s or even the 50s, we can look for models that match, houses that match the models in the catalog. And they have a pretty good range of catalogs. Their earliest one is 1908. And remember, Aladdin started selling in 1906, but didn't sell very many. So 1908 is a good starting point, in through the 30s and up through 1954. Additionally, there are Aladdin catalogs on the website archive.org. If you haven't used that before, that's another great resource. A lot of print materials have been scanned and uploaded there. So if you can't find something at the Clarke, head over to archive.org. They have some of the 60s era Aladdin catalogs. And we actually have in our possession probably one of the last Aladdin catalogs put out. This was 1980. Had a patron at the library who actually built an Aladdin house and shared that catalog with, gave that catalog to me, knowing my interest in Aladdin homes. Another great resource at the Clarke is the Aladdin sales records. And these actually come in two parts. So this is the cover of the sales index book. Generally, each year of sales had its own book. You can see how lean the 1930s were because 1931, 32, and 33 were all contained in the same book. But as you open those sales books, what you'll find is a listing starting with the sales order number, and then who that was sold to, town location, and the model of what was sold, whether that was a house or a garage or something else. And then you can see these are organized by last name, they're chronologically by order, sales order number. And so if you're looking for a particular name, you do have to go through them. Once you have an actual sales record number and you can associate it with a person or a location, then the folks at the Clarke Historical Library can pull the actual sales record. And we're going to show you an example of how that works. So this cute little house is located in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, home of the Clarke Historical Library. And it just happens to be an Aladdin house. And it's owned by a friend of ours who was fortunate enough to know one of the librarians at the Clarke Historical Library, who mentioned to them that, oh, did you know you bought an Aladdin house? So sometimes we have some information about the house that tells us that it might be from Aladdin, or perhaps somebody spotted this house and recognized that it matched an Aladdin model, but we want to learn more about it. So the first step for connecting this house to a particular person was, and this is ironically enough, named the Hamilton. This is a model by Aladdin. This is 1939. Figure out who lived in that house. And so from the city directory, we were able to find, they did this research, Agnes Bronstetter lived at 621 Andre, which is the address for the house. And they were able to go to the sales index and find Miss Bronstetter in Mount Pleasant, Mrs. Bronstetter in Mount Pleasant, and here is the actual sales record for that house. Now, one thing you'll notice right at the top, first off, it tells you when the order was received, when it was acknowledged, and it has a street address, 220 North Kinney Boulevard, which is not where that house is located. This is one thing you have to realize about sales records. Oftentimes, the addresses located on them are not the address of the actual house. So just because you see this address here doesn't mean your work is done. And another interesting thing about this is this order was actually fulfilled by truck delivery. Because Mount Pleasant's so close to Bay City, they must have decided it was cheaper to send everything by truck than by train. You can also see that she was able to select the paint colors that she wanted, and her Hamilton #1 cost her $2,495.85, and she had to put down $186 to have them start that order. Customers were encouraged to make changes to their order, and so these are not cookie cutter houses generally. That order in England was kind of an exception. Most customers made at least some changes, and then depending on how significant the change was, there might be an additional cost. Sometimes customers omitted things, so there was a deduction from their total cost. You can see here She also paid in cash, and so she got a special discount for that. That was typical for Aladdin. They like customers who paid all cash, and they would give you a discount for doing that up front if you were paying all in cash for the whole thing. And so you can see quite a few customizations in this order. And Mrs. Bronstetter also ordered a garage. Here's she ordered the Hudson #2, $326.32, and that actually had one of its own set of customizations, a little bit shorter, but significant too. And so you can see once you connect the original owner to the house, and then you're able to connect that to a sales record, you can really get a rich amount of information about when the house was ordered, how much it cost, all the details related to it. And this has been tremendously helpful to researchers. Here's an example of a house in Tacoma Park, Maryland. One of my fellow Kit House researchers found this house. She knew it was Aladdin. She'd been able to connect the Aladdin house to the location, but we all looked at it and said, what is this thing? Because it doesn't match any of the models in the catalog. And when she contacted the Clarke and they sent her the sales record for this, what they discovered is that this is an Aladdin colonial model with windows from the villa, which you saw earlier, that touch of old Italy, and a dormer from another model. And I believe the side dormers are based on yet a fourth model. So there's at least 3 or 4 different house designs that particular owner incorporated into this house in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And it was all mystery to us until we read the sales order, and then it all became clear. So we're going to finish now, giving you a photo tour of Aladdin houses of southeastern Michigan, and thank you for being so patient. I know we're running a little bit long here, but we will cruise right through these.
This is the fun part, I think.
So here's a map showing the extent of houses in southeastern Michigan, and I will say that there's 2 things you should take away from this map. One, that Aladdin houses are all over southeastern Michigan, and 2, this map in no way captures all the Aladdin houses out there. These are just the ones we've been able to locate and document. There are many, many more Aladdin houses yet to be found. I'm confident of that. And so over time, we're going to keep adding little blue bubbles to this map.
So I work at the Northville District Library, and I was very curious when we went to visit the Clarke initially. We wanted to focus on Novi and Northville since that's where we are. And as we were flipping through all of these indexes of sales, I happened upon this one, Northville, Michigan, AC Baldwin, Georgia #2. And yes, the librarian helped us and pulled the sales record for us. And we can see here that he did order it. He ordered it in June of 1919. It was shipped in July of 1919, and it cost $1,522.40. He did splurge a little bit, and he added a medicine cabinet for $4.95, and he also put oak floors in the living and dining room for $15.05. Yeah, those are the good old days and old prices. Then I wanted to do a little bit more research, so when I went back home to my work at the library, we have digitized the Northville Record newspapers. I did a search, and I see in September this little piece that said they have completed the carpenter work on the new Baldwin house on South Wing. Aha! My library is at the corner of South Wing and Katy, so on my lunch break, I decided to wander out and see if I could find a house that maybe looked a little bit like this, the Georgia. And I'm walking. Aha! There she is. It could not have been easier for me to spot had I known what I was looking for. And so she's a beauty. We love her. Prior to this, she was white, but the owners knew that the catalog image had red, and so they went back to that historic look, and they've done a lot of really good work on it. So that was an easy one to find for me. I didn't even have to get in a car, except for traveling to Mount Pleasant for all that footwork. But yes.
And there, another house that we were able to locate through the sales record is the Aladdin Venus. And actually, the Aladdin Venus has the same kind of L-shaped porch that the Georgia does, but it's turned so it's facing the street, and this is more suited for a narrow lot. And from the sales record information, we were able to locate this Venus on Eaton Street in Northville. Unfortunately, something that sometimes happens when we're doing research into kit houses, so we probably identified that 5 or 6 years ago. In 2018, wow, this happened. Just to give you a sense of real estate prices in Northville, this Venus sold for $350,000 and became a tear down, and was replaced by this $1 million plus house. And unfortunately, in certain parts of the country, either through gentrification or sometimes in other areas, it's through neglect and blight, we lose these houses. So it's a race against time for us as we try to document them before something like this happens. One community that's done a great job of documenting their Aladdin houses through the sales record is the city of Clawson. And Clawson has a historical museum, and one of the former curators there did quite a bit of research into Aladdin houses. They actually have an entire page, a couple pages on their city website. If you just Google Clawson Catalog houses, it'll take you right to it, where you can learn more about these houses. They have multiple houses from Aladdin that they've been able to authenticate. You can see here's another Georgia and another Venus. These are both located on Fisher Court in Clawson, and were built by Oswald Fisher, who also built the house that the Historical Museum is located in, which we don't believe is from Aladdin, but it's still to be discovered one way or another. And then you can also see some smaller examples from Aladdin that are located in Clawson. On the left, the Dresden, and on the right, the Edison. These are located in the downtown area of Clawson. And Clawson's home to quite a few kit houses. They have quite a few Sears houses and Montgomery Ward houses. So if you're from the area, check out the website because it'll show you where to go to see all of these. This is another recent discovery for me. This is Aladdin Amsterdam, a large Dutch colonial model in Groot-Seal. For those who are not as familiar with this part of the world, Groot-Seal is actually a large island in the Detroit River, south of Detroit. There's several kit houses that were built there, late teens and 20s, and this is an Aladdin. This is another Aladdin house, the Aladdin Maples. This one's located in St. Clair, Michigan, built in 1919. So this house is now over 100 years old. And this is an interesting find because this was actually part of one of those industrial purchases. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company of St. Clair, Michigan, which dates back to the 1880s, I believe, in 1919 purchased 11 houses from Aladdin and had those built in a neighborhood just south of their factory. If you drive a couple blocks north of this Aladdin Maples on Gough Street, you'll find the Diamond Crystal facility, and they're still going, and so is the house. Most of the other houses were a little bit more modest, so I imagine this maybe was for somebody who was maybe a plant manager or had some level of supervisory responsibility. They got slightly larger, slightly nicer house. One of the larger models and popular larger models from Aladdin, which we found and other kit house researchers have found throughout the country, is the Brentwood. The original Brentwood was built in Bay City, Michigan. This was actually one of Otto Sovereign's houses. So the Sovereign brothers didn't just own the business; they lived it literally. And this was one of the houses that Otto lived in. Here's another picture of it at night. Really cool. That diamond design is original to Aladdin houses. Sometimes a little telltale marker when you're looking for models. Here's another example of the Brentwood in Port Huron, Michigan. And one more example, this is on Morley Street in Dearborn. And you'll notice some variations between some of the elements of the house. This is, again, typical just because customizations that customers made, or sometimes they reflect the fact that these houses are, in some cases, over 100 years old, and they evolve over time. Different owners make changes to the designs and elements of the house. So we don't, most of the times when you find a house, they're not going to be catalog perfect, looking like they just were built 2 years ago, like that Georgia and Northville. Most of them have had changes, but they're still identifiable as Aladdin houses. Here's an example, a little bit more modest house, the Norfolk. This was featured on the cover of the 1922 catalog. And here's the Norfolk in Ann Arbor, Michigan on Pauline. This is in a neighborhood where you'll find quite a few kit houses. This one's Aladdin. And you can see it still has some of those original elements like the brackets. Next, we'll show you an Aladdin Stratford in Royal Oak, Michigan. This is a good example of one of the challenges that we face as kit house researchers. Because companies sold designs that were very similar to each other, because they sold designs that were popular, they oftentimes sold designs that were very similar to each other. And so you can see the bottom left, that's the Wardway Kenwood. To the right is the Sears Dover. All very similar. One thing that helps us with the Aladdin Stratford is that chimney design. Several of the Aladdin models had a chimney design like that, and it's very distinctive to the Aladdin houses. And so that helped us ID this Stratford in Royal Oak, Michigan. You can see that distinctive chimney design. And there are some other elements that help us identify this one. Is actually a Stratford #1. It came in 2 different designs. And this is the #1 design in Royal Oak, Michigan. And the very last house we're going to share with you tonight is this Aladdin Pomona in Berkeley, Michigan. And Berkeley's actually best known for its Sears houses. There's at least 40 Sears houses of all sizes and styles in Berkeley. But there are also some houses from some of the other kit house manufacturers, including Aladdin. But the Aladdin probably is most unique because of its most unique location, which is here, inside the gates of the Roseland Park Cemetery. If you ever drive down Woodward Avenue in Berkeley, as you're approaching 12 Mile Road and you see the gates of the cemetery, look to your right, and you will see that Aladdin Pomona sitting just inside the gates of the cemetery. And what's cool is when the cemetery is open, you can drive right up and get out and get a good close-up look at this Aladdin Pomona. They've taken pretty good care of it. Our understanding, it was originally purchased to be the home of the groundskeeper for the cemetery and his family. And then over the years, they have turned that into a sales office. It was purchased in 1916, so it's over 100 years old. Often frequently referred to as a Sears house in Berkeley, but it's not from Sears, it's from Aladdin. And the woman who used to be the curator at the Historical Museum in Clawson actually helped us track down the sales record before that. You can see it was sold in 1916 to the Roseland Park Cemetery Company in Royal Oak for a grand total of $1,112.33 or 38 cents. A little bit small on my screen. But this is an Aladdin Pomona in Berkeley. And with that, I want to thank the folks who helped us out with photos tonight. A lot of great photos that came from them. And that at the bottom, that little drawing there, Ann Heidemann, who lives in that cute Aladdin Hamilton in Mount Pleasant, drew up a little picture of her house. And that's our Sears Hamilton. Before we take questions, I just want to thank the Clarke Historical Library for having us present this evening. They've been a great partner, not only for tonight's presentation, but over the years, helping us do research into Aladdin homes. We've been able to locate quite a few Aladdin houses. Not only us, some other kit house researchers who I work with directly, who have been able to tap into the resources of the Clarke and really help literally have located Aladdin houses throughout the country, thanks to the resources that they provide us access to. So we really appreciate that. And with that, we will we're going to do questions here. I think I've seen a few things pop up in chat, so
Yeah, I'll share some questions with you.
Okay, go
Thanks
ahead,
for
Frank.
that free plug. I do have to tell you, we have a phrase for this around the Clarke. It's called house genealogists.
Mm, very
Basically, it's
true.
the same thing. Find my old house for me. Um, one question I received privately was to ask if Aladdin is considered the first kit house builder.
Yes, Aladdin was the first. So they started they started selling in 1906. Sears jumped on that bandwagon in 1908, but Aladdin was there first. And they were, if you want to consider that kit, we like to, sometimes it's challenging because obviously they were around for so long. But if we talk about a kit house era, when most people associate houses with that, so the 20s and the 30s, Aladdin was the first and they were the last. There are some modern companies that are selling houses by kits. In fact, I think even was it Home Depot or one of the Lowe's was selling kind of kit houses at some point. But when we consider that modern kit house era of the early 1900s, Aladdin really, they were the first.
Okay, another question I received, did Aladdin build any model homes in Bay City or anywhere else?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And this, we wanted to talk about, Wendy and I were actually talking about this earlier, and we just, in the interest of time, even though we went long anyways. So Aladdin actually did build some model homes in Bay City, and what was shared with us, so we've talked to some folks who've been involved with, we have some knowledge of Aladdin's operations going back. The way they explained it to us is Aladdin would actually, if they had a new model that they were looking to introduce to the public, they would actually build it in Bay City. And from the experience of building the house, they might find, oh, you know what, we really want to make this room bigger or this room smaller, or we maybe shouldn't try to do this thing because it's going to be too complicated for the average person to build. And then, as they built this house, then obviously they had a house that, okay, then they sold it to people. So it wasn't a model house in the sense that it was intended for you to come visit necessarily. It was more a production dry run for them. But what ended up happening is you have streets where there are multiple Aladdin houses in a row that were built for this purpose, creating that. Now, I will say I have found at least one example, and I believe this is from the early 1940s in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. They actually had somebody who was selling Aladdin homes. At that point, they kind of had evolved a little bit and actually had some local dealers. And they actually built a model home and then opened it up for the public to tour. And when that happened, they had like thousands of people go through that house. The other kit house companies did that a little bit more aggressively. They would build model homes and then encourage people to come tour them. And you would see these stories about, 5,000 people went through this house in a weekend. And that was kind of interesting too, because a lot of times they actually had built the house for somebody and then talked them into opening their house up, their brand new house that they haven't even lived in, and said, oh, do you mind letting us have like 5,000 people tramp through your house before we turn it over to you? But I'm sure there was some kind of arrangement, they would clean the floors and spiffy everything up and probably get a discount too.
We do that. It's called Parade of Homes.
Oh, Parade of Homes,
It's
sure.
not gone. It's still
Yeah,
around.
that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
I have another question. Do you know anything about their marketing and the demographics of their market? Did they or the other companies somehow try to, segregate the market by income groups or upscale or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't have a lot of information on that. One of the things, again, you go back and look at the catalog, and you could see from the models we were showing, we tried to show you kind of the diversity of houses that were available, that they really did offer something at every different price point. And so if you had very little money, and you could only afford something small, that they had something to offer in that range. For the, somebody who was a little bit more middle class, they had larger houses. And then obviously something like the villa, that was a big expensive house. That wasn't going to be something that, the average Joe working on the assembly line at Highland Park could afford. That was geared towards a much more upscale audience. But back to the question, I don't think they were specifically targeting any group. They just felt like if we offered a range of houses, you would find something in that range that would meet your needs.
Okay. Someone else has asked me, did those post-World War II subdivision developers ever use kit homes? Did they ever just buy a bunch of Aladdins?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me back that up a little bit. So we do know that there were developers pre-World War II who did that. In fact, I know of at least one in the Metro Detroit area. I haven't been able to locate the houses, but he bought multiple Aladdin houses, and he was a big residential developer. And he also did the same with Sears houses. I've been able to locate the Sears houses, and so I know he used them essentially as kind of a speculative home to start a development to kind of get people out there to look at his new development. Post World War II, I don't know. That would require, I think, a lot more research into the actual sales records, which we haven't had a chance to do yet. We were more focused on 20s and 30s. But, at some point, yeah, that would be interesting to explore to see if anybody was doing that.
Okay, I have a question for both of you, and this is one that we have to deal with here in the Clarke. When does an Aladdin house stop being an Aladdin house? How many changes can you make before it's something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we've run into this obviously with other kit house companies as well. I think my kind of rule of thumb for that is when you can no longer recognize it as the model that it was, because it's been so changed. Like, for instance, you can see our house here, kind of one-story little bungalow style looking house. We've seen two-story examples of our house, where people have like popped up a second story. Surprisingly enough, oftentimes that little dormer goes up the top with it. So you'll see a two-story house that has that tiny little dormer sitting on top, and you're like, is that still a Hamilton or not? I guess since I can still recognize it, I might consider it. But once it gets so modified that it's no longer recognizable, I think that's kind of the point. You kind of say, well, I'll record it for history, because somebody might come back and say my grandfather or my grandparents built this house. But yeah, it's hard because if I can't explain it to you, if I have to show you a picture and then explain why this looked like a house half its size, it kind of has lost its meaning at that point.
Right. There's an old joke here about the person who sent me a picture and said, we're sure this isn't Aladdin, and it had the right measurements, but after you looked at the vinyl clad siding, the vinyl windows, and the completely redone roof line, it was a little hard to really decide. We just kind of went, yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Definitely.
And we don't know when it was purchased or how, but you could find the record for us. Well, no. Do you think a kit house company could be profitable today? I think that might be our last question.
Yeah, that's a good question. And because one of the things is whenever we talk about this, we have people they say, well, why aren't companies doing that today? It would be different. First off, there are, as I said, there are companies that sell kits, but it's a lot more of the manufacturing would happen in the factory. I think it's important for people to understand these houses, other than maybe like window frames, some elements like that, everything, all the assembly was done in the field. So it was pre-cut. The lumber was pre-cut, but you were doing that assembly in the field. And in a modern version of this, you would get everything would be essentially be more like the knockdown boat, where everything was put together in the factory and then they would disassemble it, and then you would put it together back on site in big components. And the DIY then, as Sears had a saying, Aladdin kind of mimicked this as well, that a man of average skill and ability could build one of their houses. And I think the modern house is just a little bit too complicated for the average man.
And the average man doesn't have the same skill set.
That too. The average man doesn't have the same skill set. So, and that really becomes, can you reduce the costs everywhere else to make it profitable? And I just think it's pretty challenging. There's a reason that they still build houses the way they do, and they don't build them from kits, because it's just the cost savings aren't necessarily there the way that we would think they would be. So I would love to see the modern version of it, but
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
One of the things we saw in the records is Aladdin was, as time went on, was continually grappling with building codes. Okay, this jurisdiction wants the plumbing this way, this jurisdiction wants the electricity that way. It becomes much more challenging to do what they're doing. And that's why you see much of this work going into today. If you're going into this kind of market, what you really are thinking are single wide, double wide, maybe even triple wide trailer kind of things, because they can be done much more efficiently. Although in some ways they're marketing into the same communities in many ways. Although obviously they don't have, there's no upscale double wide.
Well, some people they really beef them up, but I mean that's a perfect example, Frank, because literally the entire house is built in the factory.
Yeah,
and
it's cheaper and easier, and you can meet all your code. You basically use the national codes and you build to that. But Aladdin had a lot of code problems, and also the question you raised about skill levels. Well, when you don't have any indoor plumbing, it's easy. When you suddenly want to put a bathtub in a bathroom and a toilet in, your life got a lot more complicated. And now I got to run all the wiring in there, and so life. It's also a question of what we expect to find in a house. Natural gas pipes. If you looked at that Aladdin example you had, it had the Aladdin ductless furnace, which basically was a big hot box in the bottom that let the heat up. No ducts. No natural gas, forget it. It's coal in the basement. That's what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
Anyways, that was the last of our questions. I'd like to thank you both. I've got just a slew of compliments here from people who have said thank you for this very interesting and informative presentation. We've got a private message from somebody in Bay City who owns a villa to the panelists, and you two might want to follow up on that one.
Okay, great.
Since you shared it with all of us, it's fair game for you to make contact. And so thank you all, as someone just typed. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our presenters. And I hope some of you will join us next week. Abra Behrens, who is a very well-known Michigan chef, is going to join us to kick off our new exhibit about Michigan foodways. And I will give a teaser. We have a video of her cooking, and she uses a lot of cauliflower. See, I know a teaser. Yeah, what you gonna do with it? Okay, thank you all, everyone. I'm going to sign off and end the meeting now. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.